All right, welcome everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. You'll hear the rain pounding in the background for those of you here in New York. We are reading in the virtual reading group Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. Her first major book, one of the great books of the 20th century. And the book is an attempt to understand, to comprehend, to face up to, in an unpremeditated way, the horrors of the early and mid 20th centuries. And one of the key aspects of the book is to say that anti-Semitism was not an accident. It was not something that was, unimportant to the rise of totalitarianism and the rise of Nazism in particular, and that it needs to be looked at. She has this first book, including 4 chapters on anti-Semitism, which is about 100 pages and a large part of the book, and is not always clear, what the role of all of these chapters are. A lot of it is, as she sometimes says, well, look, she did all this research into it. She was really engaged in it, and she felt that there wasn't another good book on anti-Semitism, and she wanted to publish this research. And so at times it can seem unwieldy. I mean, this is a long chapter of around 40 pages. And I think it's sometimes difficult when you're reading it with all the footnotes and all the facts and all the names, you can get lost. And so I'm going to try and make sense of what she's actually trying to do in this chapter and why it's so important. So remember that chapter 1 of the volume Anti-Semitism was on the idea of common sense and anti-Semitism as an outrage to common sense. And in chapter 1, she addresses 4 sort of common sense understandings of anti-Semitism, all of which she says are wrong, right? One is that anti-Semitism is related to nationalism, so that nationalists don't like Jews. She says that's wrong. In fact, anti-Semites were mostly anti-nationalists, internationalists. Secondly, that anti-Semitism is related to Jews' power and wealth. And she says that's wrong too. In fact, anti-Semitism emerged around the time when Jews were losing their power, even though they kept their wealth. Third is that it teaches that anti-Semitism emerges as because Jews were the scapegoats. And she says that's wrong, because we have to ask why the Jews were picked and not the bicyclists. And then fourth, she talks about the fallacy of eternal anti-Semitism, which she says, again, is wrong and simply normalizes Jew hatred and anti-Semitism and doesn't teach us, what is really behind it and therefore how we can resist it. So this second chapter, which we're reading today, the Jews, the nation state, and the birth of anti-Semitism, gives you a big part of the answer, or her answer, in the title. The Jews and the birth of anti-Semitism, and what's between them is the nation state. A huge part of the answer is going to be here that that the emergence of anti-Semitism as a kind of ideological blaming of the Jews for all sorts of world evils can't be understood through these fallacies that she talked about last week in the first chapter, but has to be understood through a real inquiry into the forms of government and the Jews' relation to both the government and the state on the one hand and to society on the other in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, that made it such that when parties or demagogues or groups wanted to attack the Jews, they had a ready audience. And she says it wasn't just, eternal anti-Semitism or cultural anti-Semitism. Something else was at play. So I just to look at this on pages 9 to 10. So at the end of chapter 1 still, she outlines the rest of the volume on anti-Semitism. And she says at the bottom of page 9, modern anti-Semitism must be seen in the more general framework of the development of the nation state, right? That's the key point. We've got to understand the rise of anti-Semitism as a political factor through the rise of the nation state. And I just want to add to that. So one of the hard parts of her approach to anti-Semitism is her distinction between political anti-Semitism and social anti-Semitism. This is not a distinction we make today when we talk about anti-Semitism or about racism or about sexism or about transism or about any other ism today. We combine them. She separates them. And so chapter 2, what we're reading today, is about political anti-Semitism. And chapter 3, which we'll read next week, is about anti-Semitism. And she thinks they're very different, and importantly so. And while social anti-Semitism can lead to all sorts of discrimination, social discrimination, you're not allowed into this club, you're not allowed to work these jobs, you can't be on this golf course, whatever it is. Political anti-Semitism is different. Political anti-Semitism actually seeks to take away your rights as a citizen, not to be on a particular club, but to be part of the country and to engage in voting or holding office or even allowed to live in the country. And she thinks social anti-Semitism can be uncomfortable, but not dangerous, whereas political anti-Semitism is deeply dangerous. And so in looking at political anti-Semitism, which is the focus of chapter 2, she's looking at it through what she calls the development of the nation state. And she says we have to combine that with aspects of Jewish history, and specifically Jewish functions during the last centuries, right? So the nation state begins to emerge in France in the 17th century. And by the late 19th, early 20th century, in her mind, the nation state is falling apart. That rise and fall of the nation state is the background for the rise of what she calls modern anti-Semitism. Modern anti-Semitism is political and ideological anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism that seeks to provide an ideological, quasi-scientific justification for why the Jews have to be either expelled or killed in order to solve certain political problems. And she says that only if we look at this confluence of the rise and fall of the nation state and the rise of anti-Semitism can we understand how anti-Semitic slogans proved the most effective means of inspiring and organizing great masses of people for imperialist expansion and destruction of the old forms of government. And so that's what this chapter, chapter 2, the Jews, the nation state, and the birth of anti-Semitism is really about. It has 5 parts. The first part, and I think the part that's theoretically the most interesting and important, is called The Equivocalities of Emancipation and the Jewish State Banker. The fundamental argument here, which she lays out right at the beginning, is that the nation state at the height of its development in the 19th century granted its Jewish inhabitants equality of rights, right? This is the Emancipation edicts that happened in the 19th century. But there's a deep and fateful contradiction, she says, hidden behind the abstract and palpable inconsistency that the Jews received their citizenship from governments which in the process of centuries had made nationality a prerequisite for citizenship and homogeneity of population when the Jews were not homogeneous, right? So what's the equivocation, the equivocality of emancipation? Well, in its most basic sense, it's that the Jews were made equal by giving them privileges first. And the people who were given privileges were largely bankers, Jewish bankers. They were given the right to live and even given aristocratic titles and live equally and have full rights, not because they were equal like everyone else, but because they were given a special privilege because the states needed them. And these states couldn't tolerate the Jews being excluded, at least the rich banker Jews being excluded, because they needed them and they needed their financial capital. They also couldn't allow the Jews to exist as a completely separate people, but they needed them also within in their equality. And this equivocality, this paradox, this contradiction is the beginning of her story. It goes like this. She tells the four-part story. If you want to go through, we'll start there, starting on page 19. But basically, she says in the 17th and 18th centuries, you have the rise of absolute monarchical states and wealthy court Jews who helped them. And these wealthy court Jews are in turn granted privileges. On page 20, she says the privileges of the court Jews had indeed an obvious similarity to the rights and liberties of the nobility or the aristocracy. And it was true that the Jews were as much afraid of losing their privileges and used the same arguments against equality as members of the aristocracy. So at the beginning, in the 17th and 18th centuries, after the 30 Years' War, Jews became court Jews, and they were given privileges, even though the main parts of the Jewish people were not considered equal. After the French Revolution in the end the end of the 18th century, you see the rise of the state, of the nation state, and the equalization of citizenship. But you start to have privileges not just for court Jews, but also for larger wealthy classes of Jews, and finally for most of the Jews in Western Europe, not Eastern Europe. And this is because these new states needed capital. And it wasn't just a few individual Jewish bankers who could provide them capital, but you needed a whole inter-European Jewish system of money lending that began to provide for the capital that these new states needed. The third stage is that once imperialism undermines the nation state and brings the bourgeoisie into politics and state finance, Jews lost their competitive position. Suddenly there were other groups, imperialist corporations, often aristocratic, sometimes bourgeois, but certainly not Jewish, who began to demand financial support from the state and work with the state. And the Jews lost their strong connection with the state. And in the fourth stage, near the end of the 19th century, Western Jewry disintegrated as a group together with the nation state. So that's the sort of four-part story she tells. The point of it is that the Jews, as moneylenders, stepped in when the state needed money, and thus they became a privileged group, granted privileges by the state. And so she says on page 12, thus at the same time and in the same countries, emancipation meant equality and privileges. And this is really her core point here. Emancipation of the Jews meant that Jews were considered equal because of the revolutionary idea of equality, which was coursing through Europe at the time. But they weren't equal in the way everyone else was equal. They were equal differently. They were equal by being granted privileges. And now here's, I think, also probably just history and uncontroversial. The controversial part, or at least one aspect of the controversial part, is that the states had an interest in granting Jews equality through privileges rather than regular equality, because they wanted the Jews to remain different. They wanted them to be different because they wanted them to be able to lend them money. They didn't want them to assimilate and take up other business jobs and work in industry. They wanted them to be their bankers. But at the same time, the Jews had an interest in this too, the wealthy Jews, because by gaining their equality through privileges, it allowed two things. First, it allowed them to still be Jews. They didn't have to assimilate. And thus they could maintain themselves as Jews, even as they had the privileges of non-Jews and citizens. Secondly, it allowed them to keep their poorer brethren in Eastern Europe separate from them. They became the privileged Jews, and then there were the non-privileged Jews, and that allowed them certain advantages, but it also allowed them to play a political role with the non-privileged Jews as the helpers of them and keep them in sort of a kind of lower class kind of condition. And so she says, you couldn't have had this situation emerge unless both the states and the Jews found an advantage of it. And that's what happened. There were two other major equivocations or contradictions that she talks about, besides the one of equality and privilege, that you found equality while also finding equality through privileges. The second is that Jews are connected to the nation state. And in the sense that I've just described, that they were the bankers and financiers of the nation state. And yet they were the non-national people. They were an international people. But then there was a third contradiction and equivocation, one that on page 23, she says is the most serious one. And she says that with so much political history, right, all their involvement in all of this work for the nation state, they had no political tradition or experience. And what she means by this is that the Jews never had their own state, and they never, therefore, pursued a Jewish politics. And thus, they developed a function in Europe in which they had economic importance, but no political power. And she says they were uninterested in power. And this is on page 24 and 25. They're detached from power. They play the innocent. They'll bank for whoever needs them, and they stay out of politics. And she says this, of course, shows that the idea of a fantasy of a Jewish government or, a Jewish conspiracy is ridiculous, because the fact what the Jews did is avoid getting involved in any power. And so what the Jews did instead, the way they defended themselves, she says, is they internalized a prejudice. The prejudice is that they could maintain their safety and their equality and their privileges by currying favor with the highest authorities, the princes, the premiers, the presidents, the national state governments. And they thus had a prejudice against the professional classes, the nobility, the lower classes. And they allied themselves with the top. And they thought as long as the top and they were on good terms, they would be protected. And that was in part what would prove their downfall. The next three sections of the chapter are on different levels, different developments of anti-Semitism. So the first one is called early anti-Semitism, which begins on page 28. And the argument of this discussion of early anti-Semitism is that there's a law. Well, this actually going to cover all three, but let me just state the law. The law, she says, and this is her law, you can call it Arendt's law on anti-Semitism, and we'll talk about whether you think it makes sense. She says the law of political anti-Semitism on page 25 is that each class comes to be in conflict with the state, and as it becomes in conflict with the state, it becomes anti-Semitic. The point is that because the Jews were identified with the state, because they were identified with the highest levels and echelons of power. Anti-Semitism emerges politically as a rhetorical strategy for each class as it comes to set itself against the state. And so she'll add to this on page 28 when she'll say that anti-Jewish feeling acquires political relevance only when it can combine with a major political issue, or when Jewish group interests come into open conflict with those of a major class of society. I want to repeat that because I think it's absolutely central to this argument. Anti-Jewish feeling. Now, remember, I told you before that she separates social anti-Semitism from political anti-Semitism. Anti-Jewish feeling is a kind of prejudice or social anti-Semitism. We don't like Jews. And that can be bad. It can have bad consequences, but it's not dangerous in her mind. This anti-Jewish feeling, she says, acquires political relevance, therefore becomes political anti-Semitism, and thus becomes dangerous only when it can combine with a major political issue, or when Jewish group interests come into open conflict with those of a major class of society. So here, as she describes in the next 20 pages or so, we see the beginning of political anti-Semitism, as she calls it. The first beginning of it is what she calls early anti-Semitism, and it begins with the nobility. So the nobility is a class. And the nobility had privileges. And they begin to lose those privileges with the rise of equality. Well, who suddenly becomes the only group in society that is allowed to have privileges? Wealthy Jews. And so she says, political anti-Semitism begins with the anti-Semitism of the nobles against the Jews. They were angry that the Jews were allowed to keep some privileges and religious difference while the aristocracy lost theirs. There's a second stage of anti-Semitism is a kind of conservative or romantic anti-Semitism, which is associated with the Catholics. And a third she'll call the liberal anti-Semitism. And all of these will be important. The beginnings of modern anti-Semitism, though, and modern parties of anti-Semitism begin at the end of the 19th century. At the time of financial scandals, the Jews were not involved, but small shop owners were. And those small shop owners were hit hard. And the lower middle classes and the petty bourgeoisie. And they came to think of the Jews as responsible because the Jews were bankers and the bankers often had to bail them out. And this led to a kind of social resentment against the Jews that became a highly, she says, explosive political element. All of this is part of what she calls early anti-Semitism. Then she talks about the first anti-Semitic parties. And here we get really the beginning of, this is on page 35 forward. And here you get a timeline that leads to the late 19th century, 1890. And so where you're going to end up with what she calls later in chapter 11, the chapter 10, no, chapter 8, the pan-European parties. I apologize. The pan-European parties, pan-Germanism and pan-Slavism. And that's going to be really the transition to totalitarianism. But these first anti-Semitic parties are the beginning of that. The first of these anti-Semitic parties, she says, were characterized by two extraordinary claims. One, they claim to be a party above all parties, thus to be associated with the state, the nation, or not the state, the nation as a whole. So the Germans as a whole, the French as a whole. And second, they claim to be supranational. Thus, unlike, they weren't actually nationalists. They were pan-German, pan-Slavic, pan-French, etc. They were aimed at uniting ethnic groups across national borders. The second and then the next instantiation is what she calls leftist anti-Semitism. And this is really where she thinks anti-Semitism begins to transition into what will become totalitarianism. And she says that the core of leftist anti-Semitism was not in France, where it was too nationalistic, and it was not in Germany, where it was still too caught up in Marxist ideas, and Marx was not an anti-Semite, he was a Jew. It was in Austria. And in Austria, anti-Semitism, she says, grew closest to imperialism. It sought to become pan-German. It sought to create a link with Germans in Switzerland and in Germany. And this anti-Semitism, where you had whole classes of people hating the Austrian state and seeking to destroy the Austrian state so that they could reunite with their German brethren in Germany and Switzerland. They came to see the state as the great obstacle to their goals. And this and since the state was again associated with Jews, anti-Semitic Jewish rhetoric again emerged as an increasingly powerful way to attack the state and unify the people of your political class and movement. So this is the argument she's making in this chapter, that anti-Semitism in its political valence, right, not in its social valence, but in its political valence, begins with this fundamental function of the Jewish banker that lasts for 200 years in Europe and associates the Jew with the state. And then once the state begins to fall apart in the 19th century and increasingly in the late 19th century, the nation state, you start to see these anti-Semitic parties emerge that are against the state. And they take the Jew as in its association with the state as an enemy. And this is the rise of political anti-Semitism. It's not yet totalitarianism. It's not yet pan-European, pan-Slavism or pan-Germanism either. We'll get there in chapter 8, but it's the beginning. And what she really wants us to understand is that there is this difference between social and political anti-Semitism, and we have to understand that difference. Today we focus on and concern mostly with what she would call social anti-Semitism, or social racism, or social feminism, or social anti-women, misogyny. She's interested in that difference. And in this chapter, she's trying to argue that there's a historical reason that the Jews were chosen as the group to be associated with the state, and thus to be discriminated against in political life because of their opposition, because of their connection to the state, and because of their general embrace of living, of acquiring equality, not through assimilation into the national people, but through privileges. It was this embrace of privileges, the connection to the state, that she says gave rise to modern anti-Semitism. All right, I'm going to stop there. It's a complicated chapter. There's a whole lot of history in it. It's a lot of history a lot of us don't know. I've been teaching this book for 20 some odd years, and every year I do it, I look at one or two of the figures that she talks about, or movements she talks about, to try and learn more about it. But it's not a world I knew when I began teaching this book, and it's very complicated. Look forward to hearing people's thoughts on it. I already see there's a lot of questions already. Remember, you can talk in the chat. You can discuss it in the chat. Look, these are complicated. These are controversial issues. They're sensitive issues. Really try and do your best to not attack a person. You can attack ideas. You can say I disagree, but make an effort to make that distinction. And that's both in the chat and if you're going to speak by answering questions. You can go down to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, hit raise hand, and join the queue to talk. And I look forward to the conversation. Jason, you're up.
Yes, sir. I want to be speaking a little outside my understanding, so I hope everyone grants me some leeway on this. This is a continuation of some of the conversation we've had in the dialogue group regarding the issue of is a work an action, or how is it related? And this really came to me here on the top of page 14 of this discussion, where Arendt writes that the Jews neglected their chances for normal capitalist enterprise and business. But without the interests and practices of the governments, the Jews could hardly have persevered their group identity. In contrast to all other groups, Jews were defined and their position determined by the body politic. Since, however, this body politic had no other social reality, they were, socially speaking, in a void. And this really rang some interesting bells for me, considering me and what Susan and I have been talking about in the dialogue group around the idea of works like arts in particular as being a way to stake a bit of a claim to kind of establish the common realm, the common world, the built world, sort of speak. And in my understanding, this notion here that to a certain degree, as a large group, Western Jews of Europe declined to build. They declined to contribute to the common world, and therefore they kind of didn't have a stake that they could raise. And is this maybe like a very big conversation that would then help us to discuss Israel? That's kind of where I'm going with this. Is works that are doing a work as a people a fundamental requirement to having a stake in the shared world, and therefore a role in the politics?
Okay. Well, let's just jump right in, Jason. Why not? Yeah. I certainly the question Jason asked, the assumptions he makes, I think, are right. Which is that for a whole host of reasons, partly that they were not allowed in certain fields, and partly that they wanted to remain separate. The Jews didn't assimilate into European society. They didn't have their own state. They were diasporic, and they didn't want to just become everyday shopkeepers and businessmen who were not Jews. They wanted to remain Jews, and this meant that she says there's no doubt that the nation state had an interest in preserving the Jews as a special group and preventing their assimilation into society. Right? They didn't want the Jews to assimilate for a whole host of reasons. Part of it, social anti-Semitism, and part of it, they felt it useful to have the Jews as an outside group. But she says that this coincided with the Jewish interest in self-preservation and group survival. This wasn't a problem in the Middle Ages because there was no claim that everyone was equal. But starting in, the 18th and 19th centuries, when you start to think that equality is the foundation for citizenship and for being in a state, most other groups came into national society, and the Jews stayed apart again for both because the states didn't want them and because they found it convenient to. And yet certain Jews were able to solve that problem through privileges, whereas the rest of them were not. Now, what this meant was that if you were born a Jew, you either were overprivileged, right, or underprivileged. You were never equal. And that's a fundamental, and she thinks, fact and an important line. Now, the question you're asking, Jason, is a question she doesn't really address here at all. And isn't, you know, is a question that is a little harder to get one's head around, which is, you know, is this fact that the Jews remained separate mean that they, you know, were not part of a common world? You know, and I think the answer has to be it has to be, well, we don't know. I mean, there were there are different ways to imagine a common world, right? You can imagine a common world in which people who are overprivileged and people who are underprivileged are included in it. And you can imagine a common world in which they're not. I think in most European countries, the Jews were part of the common world. I mean, people encountered with them, did business with them, worked with them. You know, I think I don't think you have to go as far as you're going and say, you know, the Jews were not part of a common world. I will say this, though. She doesn't think they became part of the political world. They were part of the social world. They were part of the economic world. But this is what she says is the great and the most serious equivocation, or the most serious contradiction, on page, I think, 23, if I remember correctly. Yeah, the most serious contradiction, right, is that, or the serious paradox, is that the Jews have been the only one of these peoples without a state of their own, and had been precisely for this reason so eager and so suitable for alliance with governments and states, no matter what these governments or states might represent. So they basically came to be the servers, the bankers for these states, and they had no political tradition or experience of their own. And so what they didn't have was their own Jewish class, right? She says this like 20 times in this chapter. The Jews were not a class. They, you know, they were not, like everyone else in the society became a class: the nobles, the rich, the poor, the workers. The Jews were in all different classes. They were not a class. They didn't have common political interests. And so what you can say is they didn't develop a common Jewish class or a common Jewish world. And in fact, there were all sorts of different Jewish interests, and they never really pursued those politically. And I think that's something you can say. And I think she thinks that's a problem because it meant that the Jews never had gained the political experience and influence and interests that would allow them to act politically in a way that would protect their interests. And that, she thinks, was one of the reasons they ended up making so many political mistakes over the next century or so.
Do I understand right, just in general terms, that the political realm is where we negotiate the shared world? Just in general terms.
Well, I mean, the political world is, to some degree, yes, where we negotiate a shared world, but there's also, I mean, it's not only the political world, right? I mean, we also have a shared world when we buy meat from the butcher, or you know, go to a baseball game. You know, there's lots of ways in which we share a world. And the Jews were part of all those worlds in Europe. But they stayed out of the world of politics. That's what she's saying. And in that sense, it was hard for them to pursue Jewish interests right? She talks about this one time when they tried with the Staatspartei and it was a disaster. And they also simply continually misunderstood politics and misunderstood when things got dangerous or didn't. And she thinks that was a failing on their part.
Thanks.
Yep. Jeffrey Berry.
Yes. To the extent that, well, it seems to me that the story that she is telling in chapter 2 is of a relatively small class of Jews being hated by a relatively small class of the rest of the population. And I guess, or I hope, that the rest of the book is going to explain how that really resulted in Nazi Germany, and even today in America and elsewhere in the world, all the Jews being hated by a much broader, I won't say all the rest of the population, but a much broader spectrum of the population than the story that she is telling in chapter 2. Now, obviously, you can disagree with the way I'm characterizing chapter 2, but it seems to me that it's a pretty fair assessment of the story she's telling.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So it's an interesting question, right? What she's saying is, if you want to understand the birth of modern anti-Semitism, which is not the same as ancient anti-Semitism or Jew hatred, right? There's always been Jew hatred. That is something that goes back a long way. It is not good. It's not pretty, but it's not totalitarian. There's going to be two parts to modern anti-Semitism: political and social. And if you want to understand its emergence, you have to understand its emergence in the context of the rise and fall of the nation state and the rise of anti-Semitism. Now, and the Jewish function, the nation state. Now, you're absolutely right that the number of Jews involved in this function as lenders to the nation state is small. I mean, first of all, let's start a step back. The number of Jews in Europe is small, right? I mean, we're talking about a very small minority of people in Europe. But the number of bankers and wealthy Jews is even, infinitesimal. What she's saying is these Jews were not hated, right? They were often quite liked by many of the people. They were given great privileges. They were in the court. They were, showered with all sorts of things. When anti-Semitism began politically, with anti-Semitic parties, it happened, and this is the law she announced, it happens when a certain class in society, now that class could be the aristocracy, smaller class, but it could also be the workers or the petty bourgeoisie, bigger classes, find in the state an obstacle. So, the majority of people and the working class in Austria are of Germanic origin, and they want to unite with their German brothers in Germany and Switzerland. Well, the Austrian state is an obstacle. And so they attack the Austrian state, but they do it in large part by mobilizing people against the Jews. Now, that's not a small group of Jews or a small group of people doing the mobilization. That's majority of the population. Yes, you're right that the number of people associated with the state in this story is small, the wealthy Jews. But once it shifts from to this anti-Semitic rise of anti-Semitic parties, it expands to all Jews. Now, it's a good question to ask how or why does it do that? And she doesn't have a full answer to that, but she does give one. She gives at least an answer, which I'm not sure if it's satisfying or not, to be honest with you, because I'm not an expert in this world. And that answer she gives on pages 25 through 27, talking about the Rothschilds, right? The Rothschilds were, of course, the preeminent Jewish banking family in this period, started by Meyer Rothschild. And he divided his sons up into different capitals of Europe, in Frankfurt, Paris, London, Naples, and Vienna, and created this sort of pan-European Jewish Rothschild banking network. What she says on these pages is that the rise of the House of Rothschild gave anti-Semites a flesh and blood example of the way that the Jews, A, were different, B, were international, C, put family above, nation and state, and that the family was more important than being either part of a nation or a state. And she says that to the outer world, this is on 27, about 2/3 of the way down in the paragraph beginning the exclusive position of the House of Rothschild, right? She says, to the outer world, this one family also became a symbol of the working reality of Jewish internationalism in a world of nation states and nationally organized peoples. Where indeed was there better proof of the fantastic concept of a Jewish world government than in this one family, nationals of 5 different countries, prominent everywhere, in close cooperation with at least 3 different governments, the French, the Austrian, and the British, whose frequent conflicts never for a moment shook the solidarity of interest of their state bankers. No propaganda could have created a symbol more effective for political purposes than the reality itself. And so it says the Rothschilds became the symbol of the Jews as this blood ties are stronger than national ties or anything else, that family bonds are paramount, internationalist, and sort of a nation outside of any nation, resisting assimilation, and that this became the sort of focus for the propaganda that allowed any class that wanted to take on the Jews to attack the Jews. But it wasn't just limited to a small class like the Rothschilds or even wealthy Jews. It was a way that they were able to attack all Jews. Chapter 3, which we'll read for next week, is really about that. It's about how in this period, the idea of the Jew emerged, right? And that's what we'll talk about next week. But so I don't think it's just a small group attacking and a small group being attacked. I think it's actually larger, but I understand why you asked the question. Is that all right, Jeffrey?
Yes, it does, and I appreciate the answer. My only observation would be the fact that you grant someone a privilege doesn't mean you like them. It means you tolerate them, and you can certainly resent someone that you tolerate. Mm-hmm. But I understand your point. Thank you.
Absolutely, and you're 100% right. Hannah, how are you? Hannah, Hannah, I know you're muted. You've got to unmute.
Hi. Well, I'm a little exercised because of all the things I've read by Arendt. This chapter is, her theory of anti-Semitism has been challenged by some really great thinkers, theologians and political scientists alike. the strict division between modern and quote unquote ancient or whatever anti-Semitism is really, to me, very false. I think she underestimates and does not know of the role of religion and the ongoing, pervasive, eternal almost role of the, let's say, the witness people myth that Stephen Haynes, an American Christian theologian, identified, in which the belief that whatever happens to the Jews for good or ill is an expression of God's providential justice, that is an ongoing thread throughout history, and it cannot be divorced from anti-Semitism as a whole. Also, political scientists, I read an article by Shlomo Avineri, who said that Hannah Arendt was wrong about anti-Semitism, the rise of modern anti-Semitism coinciding with the rise of with the fall of nationalism. He said it was in fact the reverse. And then also, and I have a lot of I have some examples of that if you're interested. This article appeared, well, many places, but he says that her key statement, which pervades her entire discussion of anti-Semitism, is that, quote, modern anti-Semitism grew in proportion as traditional nationalism declined and reached its climax as the exact moment when the European system of nation states and its precarious balance of power crashed. He says there's no historical support for this contention, and research shows that the opposite is true. It was the rise of the modern nation state and the challenges it faced that led to the sharp increase in anti-Semitism. As Zeev Sternhall has shown, the rise of integral nationalism at the end of the 19th century in France was channeled in the Dreyfus affair into extreme anti-Semitism, and studies by George Moss and Peter Polzer indicate a similar link in Germany and Austria. And he goes on. Finally, I'd like to say that it's interesting because I really thought Eichmann in Jerusalem was brilliant, and I didn't really, so many Jews in Israel wouldn't allow it to be Eichmann in Jerusalem printed until much later, decades after it was published. But the Jews, it aroused so much visceral disturbance. But I experienced it a little bit in this chapter where she talks about co-responsibility on page 6. So, but it's complicated because the fact is, when you force people into various roles and you force people into various positions, they then adopt behaviors that feed into their disempowerment and feed into all that stuff. Also, remember that Hitler linked the Jews with Bolshevism, and it was really one of the things that really spurred him on his path. Okay.
Thanks, Hannah. So obviously there's a lot in what Hannah's talking about. A few things. One, so Shlomo Avineri, who's a well-respected political theorist, and many other people disagree with Hannah Arendt, right? On the question of the relation between nationalism and anti-Semitism. That's true. That's great. We then have to ask, well, what do we think? There's no doubt that the majority of historians disagree with Hannah Arendt on this. I don't think that's a controversial claim. And that was true when she wrote it, and she knew it, and she repeats over and over again that historians completely get this wrong. And so, you know, if you are unconvinced by her argument, right, you know, that's going to change how you view her argument. So all I can say is we have to make the argument. You know, 19th century French extreme anti-Semitism, as you said, was nationalistic. She says that in this book, in this chapter, right? At the where she's talking about on page 48 to 50. She says nationalistic anti-Semitism, harmless when compared with modern movements, was never a monopoly of reactionaries and chauvinists in France, right? You have Louis Ferdinand Céline, one of the great anti-Semites of all time. But she says there's a reason that Hitler and the Nazis didn't take Céline seriously. And there's a reason, she says, that even in Vichy France, that the Germans didn't take the anti-Semites in Vichy France seriously. And the reason is because nationalist anti-Semitism, in the end, is not going to be effective if you want to lead to a totalitarian or fascist government. And so the problem we have here, right, is that there's no doubt that there was a nationalist anti-Semitism. That's true. She fully understands that. And that nationalist anti-Semitism has been around for centuries. Well, certainly since nationalism has been around, and it bears relation to medieval and earlier anti-Semitism. The problem is not a historical problem, right? Arendt agrees with that. Avenari and all the other historians agree with that. Arendt is making an argument about totalitarianism. And what she's saying is that if you want to understand totalitarianism, you can't base it on nationalist assumptions and nationalist anti-Semitism or any other nationalism, because it wasn't nationalist. And then we have to look in other places. And so the problem is that Avenari and others, I'll just be direct. They don't understand her argument. Now, her argument could be wrong, right? But they don't understand it. They in any way come to grips with it and take it seriously. They just say she's wrong historically because there was still nationalistic anti-Semitism. Of course there was. She would never deny that. But what she's going to say is that's not what led to totalitarianism. That's been around for 100 years, 200 years. It's been around for a long time. If you want to understand totalitarianism, you've got to understand the driving force of it, which was not nationalist. And so we need to start to look at the emergence of a new form of anti-Semitism, she calls modern ideological anti-Semitism. And she's looking for that. It's convincing to me. But that doesn't mean it should be convincing to you, Hannah. I mean, but all I'll say is, quoting me Avenari, right, and saying, well, she's wrong, he thinks she's wrong, doesn't help because he doesn't understand her. And he's never made an effort to understand her. He just reads what she says and says, oh, well, there's historical and national anti-Semitism, and therefore she's wrong. He's not trying to understand her argument about totalitarianism.
Okay.
He's so I don't think historically their argument, they actually disagree. I think she's adding something else, which is that a new form of anti-Semitism emerging, and we have to deal with that. Now on the question of
Religion.
co-responsibility, you mean?
Well, my other major point was, about like this, it sort of seems so ridiculous that she makes this break between, as if this sort of religious anti-Semitism stopped, and then the modern took over. I don't think
this is the same mistake that I was just talking about, right? She doesn't say that religious anti-Semitism stopped, right? People who are arguing about God's providential justice are still there. What she's saying is that's not what's driving the movement of Nazism.
Okay.
And so part of what she's doing in this chapter, right, is trying to give you the history of these emergent anti-Semitic parties and saying, if you look at what they're talking about, they're not talking about God's providential justice, and they're not talking about nationalism. They're talking about pan-Germanism, and they're talking about class interests, and they're talking about the state and burying the state. And this is all going to become important when we get to chapter 8 on continental imperialism and the pan movements. And in a way, this chapter 2 is the precursor to chapter 8.
Okay.
In chapter 8, where she's going to sort of really try and make the case that it was the ideological nature of pan-Germanism and pan-Bolshevism more than anything else, more than religious anti-Semitism, more than nationalism, that opened the door to totalitarianism.
Oh,
And
thank
so
you.
Thank
you so much. Thank you. That was very, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Vigdis. Hi.
Hi. This is actually the first time I read the book, and I find it very interesting to hear the discussion, since this is a field I don't know too much about when it comes to the facts. But what I find very interesting is to see how Arendt goes around to try to understand these phenomena of Nazism and Stalinism, which she then terms totalitarianism. Because to me, it seems like you kind of find what she talks about in other writings, like she's trying to reveal existing prejudices that go around, like she has these different sources to anti-Semitism, or to try to understand why the Jews were picked. And she kind of denies that this is the real ground and so on. And she seems, it is like I see that she kind of thinks between past and future as she talks about. She goes back and she does this kind of pearl diving into those facts that are relevant for answering her trying to understand the phenomena. And in that way, it's also about how we can use this kind of thinking, to how we can use what she says here, understanding the world we live in. Of course, it's to take you start with an experience. I'm sorry, I just have to let out my dog. She is insisting. Just let another.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is important is, if you think about this, what Arendt is saying about Jewish function in 17th through 19th, 20th century Europe, and you take that seriously, and you say that Jewish function is essential to understand the rise of an anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish political movement, it has to make you think about other anti or other racist political movements, and think about similar ways of analyzing them, right? I just put that out there. when I teach this text, I'm constantly looking at questions of the rise of the connection between whether it's women or African Americans in the United States, and to the extent they've turned to people have turned to, and Jews have turned to the law or national politics instead of local politics to pursue and their protection through sometimes privileges and sometimes claims of equality. And her what's so unique, and this is what Vigdis's question was making me think about, whether I don't know if it was exactly what she meant, but what's so unique about the way Arendt addresses these questions is by taking them out of the sort of way we look at it as sort of historical anti-Semitism, historical racism, historical misogyny, whatever, and looking at, how the political functions different groups play, and the way those functions then get politicized by other classes who are against, the state or the government or the group, and it really does open up in a way that very few people have followed her on, and maybe because she's wrong, or maybe because they just haven't, a new way of thinking about the rise of racist politics in the modern era. I don't know if that's where you were headed, Vigdis, but that's what some of your question was making me think about. But maybe I completely misunderstood it bore you let your dog out.
Yes, yeah, she don't like me talking in English. She starts barking though. So I think that has been so troubling. Yes, I think partly it's what I'm thinking of. I find it very, very interesting because I think it's a lot of phenomena you can understand and political things going on in the world today, and to try to see how did this start, and how can we try to understand it, and what prejudices are out in the world. How do people talk about it? And I know she wrote once in a Denk Tagebuch that the need to think arises when words taken in the ordinary sense are obscuring rather than revealing, and then thinking makes distinctions. And this, I think, is always important in the work she does. And that is also something I think it's always have to bring with us when we think about issues today. And I think so far, at least, it's what I got from this. And I found, if I just end this by, for me, two pearls in this, though, so that's relevant today, when she says on page 15 that although individual Jews in high positions remained representative of Jewry as a whole in the eyes of the Gentile world, there was little, if any, material reality behind this. And I think this is what we see today as well. There are some people that come in the media's attention, like fundamental Islamists, and people then see them as representative for all Muslims, and which is so wrong. But it's so easy that we, as in a way we see the things, we kind of make those few that make attention in the media as representative for the whole group of people. So that is the one thing. And the other is what she says, that the enormous growth of industrial and economic capacity produced a steady weakening of purely political factors, while at the same time economic forces became dominant in the international play of power. Isn't that what we see to a large extent today as well, in the fight against the great powers? So there are in a ways, I think we will find a lot of pearls to use to understand things of today. And that's, to me, what's so valuable with Arendt, and what I could call maybe her method. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the problem, is there's so many pearls in these chapters that you can't bring them all out. One that I particularly liked, we haven't talked about, so I'll just put it out there, is that in the very end on page 52, where she talks about the expansion of the independent Jewish business class. More important than the expansion of the independent Jewish class was another shift in occupational structure. As they reached a saturation point in wealth and economic fortune, this might have been the moment for them to show that they wanted money for money's or power's sake. But she says, on the contrary, the sons of the well-to-do Jewish businessmen and bankers deserted their fathers' careers for the liberal professions, purely intellectual pursuits that they had not been able to afford a few generations before. And that this turn away from power and towards a kind of cultural elite, again, she thinks has enormous consequences for the Jews, not the least of which that it emancipated the Jews from state protection, as well as from a growing consciousness of their common destiny with fellow citizens, because they became part of an intellectual, cultural, and artistic elite, and thus outside of the nation state. These are the kind of little things that you can find throughout this book and chapter, and I think all of Arendt's writings that are often some of the most interesting things to talk about. John.
Thanks. I found her discussion of the court Jews and the bankers to be particularly interesting. And it's within the context of the idea of usury and how both Judaism and Christianity saw usury as immoral, and that the Jews said that it would be okay to lend money at interest to non-Jews, and this gave the Jews an opportunity to rise in the world. It's because of the prohibition of usury, and what gets to me is that usury, either seen as extreme interest in money lending or simply lending money at any interest at all, is absolutely essential to capitalism. And she doesn't get into it in chapter 2, but I find that to be totally fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's not her, she's not, this is not a book on capitalism, clearly. Although she will talk a fair bit about capitalism and the need for capitalism to become imperialist in order to keep growing its markets, which is an argument she takes from Rosa Luxemburg, among others, in the next section on imperialism. But yes, these are good points, and I don't have much more to say about it. So thank you. Peter.
Hi. I mean, I think it's interesting because I feel kind of caught in the middle here. I'm not thinking that some of us who are contending with Arendt are saying Arendt, it's possible to may not be wrong. She might be wrong. She might not be wrong. I think it's like the critique I might make might be wrong if I say simplistically she's wrong. I think there's something within what she's saying or how she's saying it that I'd be critiquing, and not this idea that there's a tie between how Jews are perceived, identified with these court Jews, and how that unfortunately corresponds with rising nationalism, this creation of a nation state and the power it has to identify some with and some without. But having said that, I guess the question for me is a couple of ways in which I find what she's saying a little careless is the Jews to begin with. What the Jew, there's something the Jews did, there's something the Jews choose to do, and there's something that's perceived as what Jews do. Those are three different things, I think. And right off the bat with what the Jews did, the court Jews are not the Jews. So it's a little tough consistently to hear the phrase the Jews doing so many things in this chapter when we're talking about a few privileged, a very small percentage of the majority of the population, certainly of Jews in Europe, It could be there's a little more privilege and a little more wealth in Germany, but even still, that's a very small percentage of a small percentage of population. And yet she's linking this, if it's what people do, to a very small group of not even half the Jewish population, since these are all men. There are no Jewish women who are doing these things. So many ways in which Jews, as identified with just this group, would then allow me to say Christians are exploiters and are imperialists and are, no, it's those who have power get to really choose to do and do things. And this is what Jews, at least that group, is allowed to do initially before equality becomes the buzzword in that time. And they take advantage of the one space in which they're allowed to do it within their religion, and the Christians are kept from it. It's not that different from a lot of the ways in which the financial world today has been created. First, Jews were allowed to enter into some of the more unsavory parts of law practice, and then slowly everybody else was allowed to. But I guess if it's what they chose to do, that's an even bigger problem, because even if it's all the Jews, even if it's just those Jews, again, choices are limited. And again, it goes back to this notion of responsibility from the previous chapter. Are you responsible for the restrictive nature of the world you live in when you have no power and the others have the power? I think it's a tough meal to eat if you're being told you're responsible for the one thing you could do to make it in the world, in a world that prizes money at that time, especially, and in a way in which you want to be something. And yes, the Jews could not be separated. Are they the ones who, I mean, this is the same things that sometimes are argued against folks of color. We're not separated, you're separating us, you know, Plymouth Rock fell on us. So that kind of thing is, landed on us rather, that kind of thing is just a reversal of the actual order of events. And it makes it tough again to listen to. If it's talk about choices, sure, they could have chosen many other things. Sure, any average Jew could have chosen not to be separate by, let's say, going to synagogue on Sundays or doing all the things that Christians do. Well, that means I'd stop being Jewish. I would deny myself. So that's a choice. And that's the choice Jews were given from the beginning. I mean, that's the choice they had in Spain. England kicked them out without even giving them a choice. I mean, this is a history of nonstop. Jews don't get to choose. They can choose amongst two choices, slim and none. And some of Jews did that. But if it's the perception of Jews, I think that's where I can understand the point she's making, that Jews are perceived obviously by the most visible. And if it's the most visible, then that connection with the nationalist enterprise, with the dying noble enterprise and the separation there, and then with the nationalist enterprise, I can see how that might make sense, but that's got to be a little better described and more nuanced than the way it comes off in that chapter. For me.
Yeah. So thanks. Thanks. You know, I just want to be clear. I think I said this last week a couple times, maybe also in response to you as well. There's no argument here that the Jews are responsible in any kind of moral or ethical sense, right? That's not the argument she's making. So there's no claim that the Jews made the wrong choice and that's therefore they're at fault for what they're doing. There's no blame at all. And there's not, I mean, I would challenge anyone reading this book, or by the way, Eichmann in Jerusalem, to find any sentence or any implication of blame that she's placing on the Jews. There's none of that, as far as I can tell. She's seeking to understand something, right? And remember, the driving sense of the whole book is understanding, or comprehension is the unpremeditated facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. She believes that you have to understand what happened. Now, you know, it is not a blame game, but it's an attempt to understand, to say that Jews had a choice. And that if they wanted to remain Jews, they didn't have any other choice but to not assimilate. She agrees with that, and she's not in favor of assimilation. She's not blaming the Jews for it. But she's saying that that led the Jews to take certain choices foisted upon them, as you rightly say, in such a way that they allowed them to become separate, even if they got privileges that allowed them to also, you know, live in good ways, for a very small number of privileged Jews, and both the privileged Jews and others accepted that bargain and said, we don't want the poorer Jews, the mass Jews, to come in because they're going to take away our privileges. Now, again, she doesn't blame them for that either. Now, some people may. Some people say, oh, well, they should have had more, interreligious solidarity or whatever. She doesn't. She's simply trying to say, here's what happened. And why is she doing it? Why is she simply trying to understand what happened? Because she's saying that there is that one of the problems that emerged is that because the Jews acted this way, and because they didn't develop their own political traditions and their own political experiences, they didn't recognize the moment when social discrimination began to turn into political discrimination, right? This is on page 25, and I haven't read this part or cited this part, so let me just point it out. She says on 25, in the last paragraph before the break, paragraph beginning, just as the Jews, she says, just as the Jews ignored completely the growing tension between state and society, they were also the last to be aware that circumstances had forced them into the center of the conflict. They therefore never knew how to evaluate anti-Semitism, or rather never recognized the moment when social discrimination changed into political argument. For more than 100 years, anti-Semitism had slowly and gradually made its way to almost all social strata in almost all European countries until it emerged suddenly as the one issue upon which an almost unified opinion could be achieved. The law according to which this process developed was simple. Each class of society which came into a conflict with the state, as such, became anti-Semitic because the only social group which seemed to represent the state were the Jews. So, again, she's trying to understand the emergence of political anti-Semitism, these emergence of parties that were anti-Semitic parties. That's to her was new, right? Not just that there was social anti-Semitism, not that there was Jew hatred, but that there were parties that made it as core planks of their party to discriminate against Jews. And she's saying that this happened, and this becomes the law of the rise of this new form of political anti-Semitism, that each class becomes anti-Semitic when they turn against the state. And she's trying to make sense of that. Which is a far cry from blaming Jews for it or blame, at all. I don't think that's at issue.
But if these are choices that they're making, then I don't know how you can't be somehow intimating a blame or a responsibility at the very least. And I don't even know the word responsibility without the possibility of choice. So clearly they're choosing something wrong. You say she says they're naive, they're ignorant. It's interesting. I looked in the index because I haven't read the entirety of the book, and I don't see the mention of Zionism. I don't see the mention of Herzl. There are other movements within the Jewish community of the world at that time that are not necessarily given to the current man in power. When in Rome, they're ready to go in a different direction. Again, everything they choose to do is at the mercy of those who control every choice they make, other than their own, which they're then blamed for is how it feels.
Yeah.
So that she may be saying this or not isn't necessarily relevant. Some might read it that way, and therefore she's open to that critique. And you're defending her beautifully, and I'll question it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is Jerry Cohen last week said that we're reading this book today so differently than it was read when it came out. I mean, it's interesting that when this book came out, there was no real critique of these chapters, right? These chapters were read as incredibly insightful, but not as blaming the victim. And it wasn't really until the 1960s, after Eichmann and Jerusalem, that people went back to these chapters and began to read it this way. All I can say is that today we have internalized this view that if you say, oh, a group made a choice and that choice led to this, it's their fault. She's not reading it that way, right? Responsibility doesn't mean moral responsibility unless you add moral before it. It just means it's a response. It's an answer to. There were all sorts of responses. There were all sorts of actions. You know, the people make these decisions for all sorts of complicated reasons. She's interested in, in the end, she's not interested. She's interested in how totalitarianism emerged. She's making an argument, and this may be the most controversial, I think, part of her argument, that anti-Semitism is essential to totalitarianism. It's controversial because when she turns the book into a larger account of totalitarianism, which includes Bolshevism, it's harder to make the case that anti-Semitism was essential to Bolshevism, although you could. But what she's then going to do is say, well, there are two different ideologies that drove the two different totalitarianisms. One was a racist anti-Semitism, and one was a classist anti-bourgeoisism, if you will. And she's going to sort of make that case. But because she's a Jew and was in Germany and is largely began writing this focused on Germany and not the Soviet Union, this 100-page beginning of the book, you could argue gives an outsized account of anti-Semitism within her whole argument. And I say that, I mean, if any of you were still in this reading group, I think 6 years ago or so, when we first read this book in this reading group, you'll remember, or maybe remember, that I did the entirety of the anti-Semitism book in one class, in one session. Again, not because I don't think it's important, but because if you're trying to understand totalitarianism, it's unclear, at times, some of the arguments are actually very important, but there's a lot else going on here. And she says that. She says in one of the prefaces, look, no one else had written a book on anti-Semitism. I did all this research on it, and I'm going to include a lot of this material, which, is not pertinent to my overarching argument, because I think it's important and people aren't paying attention to it. But the key argument, that she's trying to make is that anti-Semitism helps lead into totalitarianism. Why? Because it's the beginnings of a transnational political ideology. How did that happen? Anti-Semitism comes to be associated with anti-statism. How'd that happen? Because of the connection between Jewish bankers and the state. Jewish bankers in the state, Jews in the state, the emergence of anti-Semitic parties against the state, pan-Germanism. Oh, and then we get to imperialism, which leads to totalitarianism. That's the arc. That's the arc, right? And, there's a lot of other stuff in here, and some of it can be really fascinating, pearls, as Vigdis was saying, and some of it, is controversial. Okay. Oh my God, we hit 2:30. Dina, you want to say something quickly?
Maybe just as we're reading this, we can sort of also keep in mind what the relationship between the historical analysis and a political one is for Arendt, right? I mean, this chapter alone does a lot in sort of both, and it also, I think, includes a critique, and I mean that in a sort of Kantian way, an exposition of the limits of historical analysis. And sort of a thinking about how the historical sometimes obscures the political elements. And it would be interesting to ask the text why it is that the political gets obscured by the historical in the first place. And I just want to note that in the German edition of this book, which Arendt didn't translate, Roger, you'll correct me, didn't translate in its entirety, but did add, I think, close to 100 pages. That theme comes out a little more concretely, this idea that this is really a political analysis and not so much a historical one, even though history is obviously very important.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about this book is the way in which almost every chapter includes both what you might call a superstructure and a substructure analysis, a historical and a theoretical. And so yes, I mean, this chapter has a lot of history in it, but in the end, it's not a historical argument, right? It's a political argument. And I think you're absolutely right about that. I know there's other questions, but we're gonna have to end. And next week we're reading The Social Question, which again is a fascinating historical account of the rise of modern social anti-Semitism. I look forward to discussing with you. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and thank you very much. Take care.
Gracias, Professor Roger. Gracias.
Yes, everybody.
Thank you. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.